Thank you everyone for joining us. We're going to have two presentations today covering both environmental funding in the state budget and legislation that's moving forward this session. So first up, we have a presentation from the Legislative Analyst's Office, and that's going to be focused on the budget mainly. So the LAO is a nonpartisan office that provides fiscal and policy advice to the California legislature and analyzes the state budget, proposed legislation, and economic trends to help lawmakers make informed decisions. So joining us today are Helen Kirstein and Rachel Ehlers. Helen is a principal fiscal and policy analyst with the LAO, where she specializes in air quality, energy and electricity, and climate change mitigation. And then Rachel is a deputy legislative analyst at the LAO, where she helps lead the office's analysis across environmental and transportation issues. So thank you so much, Helen and Rachel, for joining us today. With that, I'll go ahead and turn it over to you, and I'll make sure that you are able to share your screen.
Great. Thank you. Good morning, everybody. So Helen, I think you're going to share.
I'm still waiting for that sharing to be turned on. So.
Okay. Well, I'll fill while we're waiting for technology. Thanks so much for having us. So as Meg mentioned, the LAO, we are the nonpartisan state advisors to the legislature. We work for both the Democrats and the Republicans, both the Assembly and the Senate. And there are about 50 or so of us in the office, about 40 analytical staff, and there are 6 of us in our environment and transportation unit that Helen and I serve in. So also, as Meg noted, we do have a variety of responsibilities. Helen, it's not on presentation mode right now. But what we'll talk about today mostly is the state budget. That's what we spend pretty much January to June working on. There we go. Thanks. Kind of analyzing what the governor has proposed, giving advice to the legislature, testifying in hearings, kind of helping them work through it. So what we'll talk about this morning is what passed in the budget in end of June, and then what is still to come. This year is, in contrast to most years, there's still kind of a lot to do. The legislature is back. They came back yesterday from their summer recess. And they'll be here for the next month only. So this week, they're pretty busy doing redistricting conversations, which means it's going to be even more work to do in the remaining 3 weeks. So we'll talk a little bit about what's done and then what's still to come. Helen, can you go to the next slide? Okay, so this is kind of what I just talked about. I guess I will just mention the other thing that we do a lot of is work for the ballot. We write the voter guide that you get in the mail describing the fiscal impacts of the propositions that end up on the ballot. But before propositions qualify, we have to also do fiscal analysis of those letters. So I think that's not always known about what our office does, and we like to make sure that you as California taxpayers understand that we are also filling that role. Okay, next slide. So what we'll talk about today is first kind of start with big budget picture. What was the situation and what was the kind of overall architecture that the legislature and governor had to work on solving? Then we'll talk specifically about environmental programs, since we know that that's a primary interest to this group, and then talk a little bit about what we think is coming ahead. Next slide. So in January, when the governor first released his budget proposal for the legislature to debate and deliberate on, we estimated that the budget proposal from the governor was relatively balanced, roughly balanced. We were kind of slightly different estimates, but roughly in the ballpark. That changed. The estimates changed over the course of the spring. To then forecast a multi-billion-dollar, like on the order of kind of $14 billion deficit for the state's general fund by May, when the governor released his May revision. So that was a hole that the legislature had to fill in crafting their budget response. They used various approaches to do this. There were reductions. cutting spending. That was mostly done in the health program. There were some in the environmental programs that we can talk about. Some borrowing internally across years and from special funds that had some funds in their balances, and then shifting funds, which also happened on the environmental side from one source to another. Next slide, Helen.
Sorry, I'm having a few technical difficulties.
You're doing great. Okay, so now I'm going to pass it over to Helen to talk about what specifically happened in the environmental programs.
Yeah, so now that you have that sort of broad context, a lot of those themes carry forward to what happened in the environmental space specifically. I'm going to talk about 3 key themes in the June budget that came up in the environmental program space. So the first, not surprisingly, given the size of the budget deficit that the state experienced, there was relatively little capacity for new general fund augmentations. Now, this probably isn't surprising in the space in general, because one of the things to note is that often there's not a lot of general fund in a lot of the resources and environmental protection areas. There are a lot of special funds the state uses to fund those programs. But when we had a big surplus, we did spend a lot of general fund in this area. That was kind of abnormal, actually. So we're going back to sort of more of the normal situation, and maybe even a little bit more extreme, where there just really wasn't much capacity for new general fund augmentations. There were a few exceptions. For example, there was some additional money to continue the transition of seasonal firefighters to permanent firefighters. There was also some money, a little bit for flood management support and for this decommissioning, but really we're talking about in the tens of millions, which in the scheme of the state's budget is relatively modest. So there wasn't much space for new general fund augmentations this year. Also, the state really was focused on finding ways to use this space and other ways throughout the budget to try to find savings for the general fund because of that deficit. So there were also a number of actions where we basically were doing things to try to free up general fund. One of the key ways to do that was that there were some programs that had been given general fund in previous years. Those were reduced or in some cases eliminated. And the expectation is that Proposition 4 funds, the bond that was passed in November by voters, will backfill many of those reductions. So that was one way in which we were having sort of basically using bond funds to supplant general fund and provide some general fund relief. Another really major way is that the state has the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund, which many of you may be familiar with. That's a fund that receives funds from the sale of auction revenues from cap and trade. And it's a significant special fund that the state has. Historically, that has not gone to sort of provide general fund relief, but this year it did in a pretty major way. So there was significant funding that was used from the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund to support CAL FIRE for the next few years. And those were CAL FIRE costs. They're not sort of new CAL FIRE costs. They're CAL FIRE costs that would have been paid for by the general fund. Instead, we're using the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund. So again, that basically provides some general fund relief. And there was sort of a similar, smaller fund shift to support the motor vehicle account, which has some significant structural insolvency issues. So basically trying to use these funds to try to make sure we are in a better shape with our general fund. There were also some other other kind of significant ways that we helped the general fund in the resources space. One was shifting some special fund costs or some general fund costs to the special fund for Exide cleanup. And then also last year, this sort of control section thing, it sounds a little techie, but last year, basically there was a provision in what was known as a control section. The name doesn't really matter, but just think of it as basically sort of unallocated cuts. There were some percentage cuts that departments were supposed to make, as well as they were supposed to sweep vacant positions. And that was sort of assumed as part of this budget. And then this budget actually implemented many of those reductions. So there are a few departments that were spared, but there were some sort of reductions that were made broadly to try to achieve general fund savings. Another kind of key thing to keep in mind is that, again, as I mentioned, typically there's a lot of special fund money in our space, and there were some special fund augmentations this year that were made. One of them was some initial appropriations of Proposition 4. They were pretty modest. Those were done as part of early action. They were for some conservancies and a tribal fire training center. We'll talk about this later in the presentation, that most of the Prop 4 allocations are still pending. And so that's something that's anticipated to happen in the next month. The legislature will probably take action to appropriate kind of the first year, the rest of the first year appropriations for Proposition 4. There were also some other significant non-general fund augmentations, including some settlement funds that the state received, which went to a kind of a zero emission truck and bus program. There were some federal funds that the state still expects to retain. There are many funds that are kind of in question now, but there are some funds that the state expects to retain for this GRIP 2 program. So those, there was federal fund authority that was provided for that. That was about like $700 million, so significant. And then there was also some federal funding for the Salton Sea restoration. So even in the context of the budget deficit, there were some augmentations that were able to be made, mostly on the special fund side. It's also really notable that this year there was a lot of activity in terms of trailer bills. I know there was some discussion earlier about the CEQA exemption. That was probably the biggest and most significant one that we've seen so far, providing not just in the housing space, but CEQA exemptions for a range of types of projects, wildfire resilience, community water systems, some parks and trails, some advanced manufacturing, a variety of different types of projects. So that was really a big kind of policy change that went through the budget process. And then there were also some more limited changes in terms of permitting rules for residential projects in the coastal zone. And then there was kind of a variety of smaller energy-related trailer bills. And there, as we'll talk about more, there's quite a few other energy-related things that are still outstanding. So one of the things to note is that there are a lot of things that are still out there that have not yet totally been resolved. So the next month is going to be a really busy one. One of the big things that has not yet been resolved is cap and trade, both the trailer bill that would extend the program through potentially 2045. That has not yet been acted on. Also, the bulk of the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund expenditure plan has not yet been acted on. So as I mentioned, there were a couple of pieces that the legislature did take action on to provide some general fund relief and to support the motor vehicle account. But the remainder of the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund expenditure plan has not yet been decided on by the legislature. So that's a key decision in the next month. Also, most of Prop 4 has not yet been decided on. So again, there were some things related to the conservancies and that tribal center that were acted on as part of early action, but most of it has not yet been resolved. There are also, as was, I think, some mention of earlier as well, there are some big water-related trailer bills that are still outstanding, including related to the Delta Conveyance Project, also water quality control plans. And then there also are a variety of, these are mostly smaller energy-related trailer bills that did not yet receive action. And so they're still outstanding and pending and likely to be decided within the next month. So back to you, Rachel.
Okay. So next slide, please. So as we look ahead at what we think maybe will happen in the next few weeks, it follows pretty closely to what Helen just talked about in terms of what wasn't acted on as part of the first round of budget. It was discussed, but kind of deferred until later this summer. So cap and trade is a really big one. That's one of the state's kind of landmark climate programs, and it's scheduled to sunset in 2030, but it does generate money through auctions, the sale of allowances. They call them permission to emit greenhouse gases. Basically, companies, emitters buy those, and that generates money that the state can then spend. Those auctions have been generating kind of decreasing amounts of revenue in recent quarterly auctions, in part because of uncertainty whether the program will be extended or not. So I think there's a lot of pressure to take action on that, to get some certainty around both our climate policies, but also those revenues, and for both emitters and for the state's policies. So we know that that's a big priority, and we would expect that something will happen with that in the next few weeks. Similarly, the $10 billion Proposition 4 climate bond that voters passed, I think there's an expectation both probably on the part of folks who are ready to spend that money, maybe some folks who are in this virtual room right now, and the legislature to appropriate more of that funding. The governor's proposal was about 2.5 billion out of that 10 to be allocated in this budget year, or now current year. So we would expect that there will be some action from the legislature for allocating more of that funding, and then some of these outstanding trailer bills that Helen mentioned. There has been, since the budget passed, pretty significant action on the federal level in terms of rolling back funding that had already been provided and making cuts. There could be some action on that in the legislature. I don't know. I don't know whether that will happen in the next 3 weeks. That could be something that the legislature comes back in the fall and has a special session to address, or potentially next year. I think there's still uncertainty in some areas about what those are actually going to be. And of course, the state is not in a fiscal position to be able to come forth and backfill all of those cuts, for example, given our own fiscal pressures. And then there are many other policy priorities being discussed, including oil and gas drilling in Kern County and across the state, whether the state wants to do more to generate more oil and gas production in the state to help ensure that gas prices don't get too high. That's a big topic of conversation in Sacramento right now. Wildfire, and in particularly the state's wildfire fund that is kind of supposed to be a reserve in order to help pay for big catastrophic wildfires, which we had in January. And so I think there's concern that reserve fund may end up being drained. And so do we need to do things to shore it up to protect and be prepared for the next big wildfire? So no small number of of issues for the legislature to grapple with in the next few weeks. We wanted to close with just giving a little bit more context about looking ahead, not just for this 2025-26 fiscal year, but the future years. There's a lot of uncertainty around revenues always, but I think increasingly right now with federal fiscal policy and tariffs and Federal Reserve. There's a lot of uncertainty on the horizon, but as of now, both our office and the Governor's Department of Finance are projecting pretty significant general fund deficits for the next few years. I don't know, Helen, do we have, I think on the next slide, we've got a picture of our forecast. So this was as of May before the final budget, but it's pretty similar to what we would forecast, I think. So the red is from our office, the orange is from the Department of Finance, but you can see they're pretty similar, and you can see it's, over 10 up to close to $20 billion deficits if we spend at what our existing programs as of today are forecasting to spend, and our revenue compared to our revenue forecast. This is the gap. So that means not only if this situation holds, not only is there not really room for major new general fund spending, but there will have to be additional actions taken, whether that's more cuts or raising more revenues to try and address this gap. So that's the background context of all of these conversations. It's not just a current year in the middle, whoops, we've got a shortfall we got to handle. It's looking ahead as well. So with that, I think we left some time for some questions. We're happy to talk about whatever you all want to talk about.
Does anyone have any questions? Please feel free to just unmute.
I do.
Go ahead, Bob.
So in one of your slides, you're talking about ongoing discussions about in the budget for Delta conveyance facilities. The history of over the last 10 years or so, and maybe even longer, but it had the phrase users pay. So those who are contracting for state water project water would pay for the facilities. So why is it now in the discussion of general fund budget?
Yeah. There aren't actually any proposals to use general fund for Delta conveyance. Really, it's policy changes its trailer bill regarding the Delta conveyance. So there are two major categories of proposals the governor had. One was around the Delta water quality control plan that the State Water Board is working on right now to exempt that from CEQA, which would help it get adopted more quickly. That's one category. And then the other was a package of various different policy changes intended to help the Delta conveyance program project get built more quickly. So those were not received very well by the legislature, I will say, in May, but they're still floating around. But it's not spending, it's policy, really.
Okay, thank you.
Jan?
Hi, thanks for the presentation. I have a question. It's very hard for the public to keep up with this shifting of funds and allocated funds. And I have recently been out looking, given the refineries closing and so forth. There was a just transition fund to help workers and communities and so forth when a refinery closed. And of course, that was just a beginning and it wasn't enough. And it seemed like there was money sitting out there that hadn't been spent. So I would ask this for clarification. Was it all spent or not? Or was it moved some other place? How do we know when things are moved, whether they're just going to be penciled out or whether they're going to be backfilled at some point? Where do we go to find that information? Thanks.
I'll answer your second question and then kick the first one to Helen, which we may not know the answer to that particular fund, but agree. First, I'll validate. Yes, very complicated to follow all of this. A couple of websites I would suggest is first ours, the lao.ca.gov. You know, we try to be translators. That's what we view as one of our big roles of what's happening and what the most important actions are. In particular, we put out a publication every fall called the State Spending Plan that really summarizes what's in the state budget and what the most important things are. The other website is the Department of Finance, dof.ca.gov, and they have a ton of information there, so much that it can be really complicated and hard to track. But you know, they publish each department and agency's budget by fund source, by activity. So that's known as the budget galley. So there is a fair amount of information, but yeah, it's a big, large, complicated budget with lots of moving pieces. So I validate that. Helen, I don't know anything about the Just Transition Fund. I don't know if you do.
I don't know anything about that either. So feel free to follow up with me if you have more details and I can see if I can look into it. But yeah, I don't know about that particular fund, but I do think this is a challenge, right? We have refineries closing, we have potential impacts on local communities. And in this kind of environment of very constrained fiscal resources, the state's going to have probably pretty limited capacity to try to, help support those communities. And so I think that that's just going to be kind of a challenge that we're going to face moving forward is how do we kind of address those that issue and the many myriad other issues the state faces in this likely constrained fiscal environment.
I see Bob Brown's hand up.
Yeah, thank you. Bob Brown with Western States Petroleum Association. Obviously, we're very keyed into, the in-state production issue you referenced earlier, but I wanted to ask about AB 617, which was a program passed with the last cap and trade reauthorization in 2017, I believe it was. Where does state funding, ongoing state funding, with that? Is a program that gives the community, state of California, kind of empowerment, so to speak, and working with the air districts and creating their own clean air plans. So I'm just curious where the funding is on that, because I know there's very strict.
That's been funded out of the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund, and it's been one that the state has pretty consistently provided funding for, but it hasn't been one that's been in statute that says this amount of money has to go to that program. So I think and that was one that was, as my understanding is, that was one that was kind of originally funded as part of the last reauthorization of cap and trade. in 2017 under AB 398. So the legislature part of the deal was, hey, we're going to put some money aside to address these local air pollutant issues. And that's going to be kind of a part of that deal. Now, I will say that the legislature is currently deliberating on what it's going to do in terms of its cap and trade expenditure plan, and their discussions both about this next coming, this year, but also about the longer term, sort of choices around how to allocate those funds. And I think one of the potential programs that has come up, and I think there are discussions likely happening about, is that program. How much does the legislature want to put in? Does it want to have that in statute? Does it want to make kind of annual decisions on that? I think those are the kinds of discussions that are probably happening, and will continue to happen this next month as the legislature makes those decisions. But there isn't any current because that expenditure plan hasn't yet been fully determined. It's still kind of a question mark in terms of kind of how it's going to play out.
Great, thank you.
Any other questions for our presenters? If not, let's see. Pablo, are you here and have you joined us? There you are. Great. Then I think what we'll do now is we'll go ahead and move on to Pablo's presentation about legislation. Helen and Rachel, thank you so much for being here with us today. If you want to stay on to answer any questions on the line, you're welcome to, but if you have to go, we completely understand. Thank you so much for being here. And with that, I will go ahead and introduce Pablo. He is the Chief Consultant for the Committee on Water Parks and Wildlife in the State Assembly. In this role, he oversees the analysis of legislation in the committee's jurisdiction, works to identify relevant policy issues for further investigation through oversight and informal hearings, and advises the committee chair on environmental policy issues. So Pablo has presented at our task force a couple times now, and we really appreciate his insights on the progress and impacts of state legislation. So with that, I'll turn it over to Pablo.
Hey, good morning. Thanks for the intro. I think I'm just going to riff. I'm sorry. And hopefully it's more of a dialogue and there's questions. But yeah, I know I've spoken with the group before and I see some familiar names and faces. So thank you for the invitation to be here again. I think I can talk a little more about what I do, what the legislature's been focused on this year, and kind of, we're in the final month of the legislative session. So there's some big issues playing out. So I can kind of touch on that. And then hopefully, I'll just happy to answer questions and have more of a conversation with everyone. So yeah, thanks, Meg. You kind of went over my quick bio, and I think I can explain that a little bit more. I always think being a consultant is a weird name. You're probably some former consultants or former consultants on this call. We're really policy analysts. What I do is, for the bills that are introduced that are within the committee's jurisdiction, and water parks and wildlife is pretty self-explanatory. Those bills are referred to the committee, and then one of the main things I do is I write the analysis of the bill, explain what it does, and give advice to the chair about the direction to take. And it can be a yes, no, or yes with changes, etc. I've been here coming up on 5 years in December, but I've been in and around the legislature for over 20 years now. It's funny to think of. I started here in 2003 as a legislative assistant. Worked in the Capitol in the legislature for about 5 years, and then I was outside for a little over a dozen years, lobbying for environmental NGOs. I worked for the Nature Conservancy and Environmental Defense Fund, and then I came back here, almost 5 years ago in December. I think I focus more on water policy. I mean, my joke is we're water parks and wildlife. I'm the slacker because I just do water. My colleague does parks and wildlife. But, it's been, I'd say, and I know we talked last year, I would say it hasn't been really a big water year in terms of policy. You know, I'm sure you've tracked this over, over the years as well, but it seems like when we're in a drought or coming out of a drought is when we kind of have these bigger conversations about reform. I think of the 2012 to 2016 drought, and that's a lot got done. It was a horrible thing for water agencies and for agriculture and for the environment. But on the policy side, a lot of important things happened. And we in 2014 we passed the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act. We're implementing that well underway implementing that now, and it was finally sort of creating a comprehensive framework for managing groundwater. Proposition 1 was also passed in 2014. So and I think moving forward in the 2020 to 2023 drought. That like when I started, we immediately found ourselves in a drought situation. And in 2023, there was a big package. And then I guess the drought ended in winter 2023, actually. But there was kind of a package of water rights reform bills that was very controversial. And I think I might have spoken to the group about those before. But sort of, I guess my observation is that when there's a crisis is when there's more interest or motivation to work on water policy. I think it's interesting in some way, the water sectors in the States, in my view, has been so successful that most people don't really think about water day to day. They sort of take it for granted that, they turn on the tap, it's going to be there. And, so they don't really think about, what it takes to get it there until, it's under threat. They can't water their lawn or something. And that's when you start having the public awareness of water and water issues kind of increases. So like I said, this year I feel like, there's always several water bills, but there hasn't been any major, fights, I think. I'm trying to think, jog my memory. I'm working for, my chair is Diane Papin from, she's from San Mateo, kind of the peninsula area. And she's got a bill dealing with groundwater adjudications that I've been staffing. That's AB 1413. But it's affects really the basin, the groundwater basins in state, largely on the Central Coast and the San Joaquin and Sacramento valleys. So it's not as much. It's not getting as and I'm not saying it should. It's kind of the people who are in those basins are more interested in it than Southern California or the Bay Area. But we're really trying to sort of kind of respect the work of local agencies to manage groundwater, I think is kind of how I view the bill. I think we're, probably one of the biggest issues we're dealing with right now is delta conveyance. And there's a long history on the peripheral canal and the tunnel, the twin tunnels, and now the single tunnel and delta conveyance project. There's a policy proposal that the governor released in May that was intended to be part of the budget that basically tries to streamline a lot of the project approvals for that specific project. The legislature rejected that proposal in May and June, and it rejected including it in the budget, I should say, and now and so deferred it to the policy process. It kind of felt, I think the rationale being that it was inappropriate to be included in the larger budget package. So I think in these final 4 weeks, that's one of the issues we're watching to see. Does that become a proposal that we have to deal with? If so, this committee would likely have to hear it, and I'd probably have to analyze it. So I mean, that's kind of jumping ahead of where we're kind of some of the big issues we're contending with right now is the delta conveyance issue. And as I'm sure you're aware, it's incredibly controversial. Most of the Delta area legislators are really diametrically opposed to that proposal. And like I said, I don't know if you've seen it. It sort of does a lot of things to streamline land acquisition for the project, to streamline CEQA review for the project, to streamline the water right proceeding. And then it changes. You know, the Department of Water Resources attempted to issue bonds to help finance the project that would be, you know, paid back over time by the beneficiaries of the project, but they lost a validation case. So that, you know, they did a validation action so they could issue those bonds, and they lost on that. It's on appeal, but one of the things that this proposal does is it tries to address the issues raised in that litigation. And, I mean, the chief one is that the department was relying on the project definition of the state water project from, you know, the early 1960s, and said that the tunnel was part of that project description. And I think that was one of the issues in the case, is that whether or not that was part of the original project description or not, and therefore whether or not the department could issue bonds. So the court ruled against them. We'll see how they do on appeal, but there's a proposal to sort of address, make changes to the project description so the tunnel is clearly in there. Anyway, so we'll see. You know, I don't know. I'm hearing from water agencies and a few folks who are interested in that. We have just under 4 weeks to go. It seems like a really heavy lift, if you ask me, but it's kind of in the mix. You know, another big issue playing out right now is the Bay Delta Plan update. You know, this is the water quality control plan for the Bay Delta that, you know, this process to do this update kind of started around 2008. There was a big push at the end of the Brown administration to do a voluntary agreement to kind of implement things faster, kind of do some more, do some habitat restoration. Newsom, when he came into office, embraced that, and then it's been kind of going on for, you know, the last several years. But at the end of July, the State Water Board released a new update, and they're planning a hearing in, I guess, on September 8th, I think, to take public input. And I think they're really hoping to wrap that up by the end of this year. But it's not a decision before the legislature. It's really a decision of the State Water Resources Control Board. But the administration has proposed, you know, another proposal they have is a CEQA exemption for all water quality control plans. And they really like to see that happen. And so that's another question we're grappling with here in the legislature, whether or not to grant that. It was also a proposal that the governor put out as part of the May, you know, the budget in May. And that was also rejected and deferred to the policy process. So there's not a proposal like in print, as we say, but we know there's a lot of interest from the governor and the State Water Board in getting that across the finish line to help expedite approval and implementation of the Bay Delta Plan update. So it's a lot, you know, a lot of Delta stuff kind of in the mix. I think a lot of the water agencies largely support that are affected by the Bay Delta Plan. They support the updated version, and they'd like to see the CEQA exemption for that plan. You know, another issue, you probably all remember Proposition 4 was the, you know, $10 billion climate resilience bond passed by voters last November. We haven't completed an expenditure plan yet. The money is authorized through the bond, but it takes the legislature to appropriate the money for it to actually start going out the door. So this was something the governor had a proposal with his budget in early January about how to spend the money. That was deferred, and so it's sort of an unfinished item in these final 4 weeks. I know my boss is really interested in seeing money go out the door. I think a lot of legislators, particularly those like her who worked on it, really want to see money get out the door sooner rather than later. If the legislature doesn't do it now, you know, it won't happen until next year. It just kind of delays, you know, moving money for good projects. So I think if I'm making a prediction, I mean, hearing a lot of rumors about it won't happen, a lot of concern from, you know, water agencies, from environmental conservation groups. I think in the end we'll do that. I think that's the easiest thing. That's one of the easier things the legislature has before it in these final weeks, because there's not really a lot of controversy. So I hope we get that done, because there's a lot. Again, there's a lot of important funding for projects that we really need to see happen. Kind of stepping outside my lane, I think, stuff I don't work on directly, but I'm sure you've read about the redistricting thing. That's supposed to be voted on Thursday. I think it's a done deal. That's not my issue area, but this is just like one of these high profile issues before the legislature. The cap and trade reauthorization and expenditure of the revenue generated by the cap and trade program is on the to-do list. Fortunately, I don't work on it, but that's a big one. I think I'm missing a few items. Oh, there's some interest in oil refineries, which I think affects the East Bay for sure. Again, it's not an issue I really focus on, but I know there's a proposal to sort of help ease the regulatory burden on some of the refineries, because I think there's some threats that some of them will shut down. I don't know, due to maintenance issues or other things. I've sort of read some of the news items on it, but I'm not in the mix on the specific policy proposal. But that's another thing the legislature has before it. And then I'm probably going to say this wrong. The wildfire fund, I think it's the insurance. I don't know if it's the FAIR plan, but it's kind of there's something going on in the wildfire space about the state's fund to kind of compensate victims of wildfire, and it's I think due to the Southern California wildfires earlier in the year. It's not, it's in the red. It's just as far as I am. So that anyway, that's all. I mean, in those last few issues are things I don't work on directly. But as all to say, there's a lot on the to-do list, between now and the end of the legislative session, which we're as of yesterday was 4 weeks, so the legislature will adjourn on September 12th is the final. So we'll see. It's going to be interesting to watch this and be here. Anyway, I think, I mean, that's kind of all I have. I feel like I'm riffing here, but those are some of the timely issues right now. I don't know if there's other issues you guys would like to talk more about, or if there's questions, but I'm happy to open it up for questions or more of a discussion. Or if there's an issue, you want to hear more about, I'm happy to dive in.
I saw Gary's hand first, and then Dave.
All right. Thanks, Meg. So Pablo, and actually Helen and Rachel, in your guys' world up there in Sacramento, is there any discussion on how to help the Sites Reservoir project get across the finish line as it relates to either legislation or funding?
Yeah. You want to go, Rachel?
I mean, I don't have a long answer other than I'm not hearing that as a top priority or proposal at this point. I think, there was some state funding from Proposition 1 provided. I think that the project seems to be moving along in terms of getting permitting checked off, and Pablo may know more than me, but I haven't heard that as a big topic of legislative action at this point.
Yeah. No, the same. I will say, there was an infrastructure package in June of 2023 that had some CEQA streamlining, and the sites was definitely one of the projects they had in mind for that. And like you probably saw that the CEQA case was actually resolved. The streamlining was that they have to resolve CEQA challenges within 270 days if practicable, and I think it got resolved in like 267 days or something like that. The governor proclaimed victory. I don't know if that streamlining actually had anything to do with getting it done, but it's certainly a nice aspirational thing to resolve a CEQA suit sooner rather than later. And then, it's I'm sure you guys are familiar with it, but the Los Vaqueros project was it last fall, or when it kind of pulled back, announced that they weren't going to move forward with that project. There was a discussion about reallocating some of the Prop 1 funding that went to Los Vaqueros to other projects. And I don't know if that happened, Rach. I thought there was a budget proposal. Maybe we already did that.
It's up to the Water Commission. It's not a legislative
Is that what?
issue.
Yeah.
So, I'm not sure where that stands, but I know that
Yeah.
they will do that because they don't money. We don't want to not spend the bond money. So,
Right.
It will be reallocated somewhere. I think. Last I checked, they were still deliberating on where, but that's not a legislative decision.
They're discussing that
thanks for
on
reminding
Wednesday.
me. Yeah. Oh, someone was saying something.
They're discussing that on Wednesday.
So potentially more funding for the size reservoir, and I mean, they come around. The kind of it's the executive officer of the I think it's the JPA and some of the members. You come around about once a year and talk, give us an update on the project. But there's not like a specific question before the legislature right now dealing with it. It's sort of, the cost. Well, all these infrastructure projects, the costs keep going up. So it's just sort of, how are we going to fund it? I know Site's got a loan from the EPA, like a WIFIA loan, low interest loan from EPA during the Biden administration. And I think, I don't know, I haven't heard anything about whether or not that's still going to be on it, but there's this big question mark over federal funding for California right now, given kind of the partisanship in DC. So there's a lot of uncertainty. But
Okay, thank you.
yeah.
Go ahead, Dave.
Yeah, Pablo, thank you very much. Question for you. We had an article this morning in the newspaper about losing capacity in the canal to Southern California from subsidence, and there have been a number of those articles. Is there any discussion beginning at all or in the legislature about that long-term issue and how the heck to deal with it if they're going to?
Yeah, it's sort of off the radar right now, but I think it will be on the radar very soon. I mean, I think, I've been tracking this a little bit this year, was looking at the 2023 report, and then I think there was a 2017 report, DWR, that talked about these problems. I mean, a few years ago, we dealt with, Frank Kern Canal has similar issues, and they came through, I want to say in 2022 or 2023, it was probably 2022. There was actually a legislative proposal, and they're trying to get funding to help Frank Kern Canal address their reduced capacity due to subsidence. And I think we put 100 million in the budget. We had those 2 crazy years where there was just these amazing, crazy surplus years during the pandemic. And so they put 100 million, but part of the deal is like some of that money would go to the California Aqueduct. But I remember talking to the water agencies and even the Department of Water Resources at the time, is they didn't have a firm estimate of the cost. But now I think they've made a lot of progress clearly with this report and kind of the news that's coming out there. I mean, I saw an article in the President B yesterday, and then DWR put something out just yesterday afternoon. So yeah, it's been under the radar, but I think that's going to change really fast. And it's something I need to talk to my chair about, like an informational oversight hearing on that. It's really troubling to see that. The ballpark, I think, is, $3 billion, I think, and I bet it will be more than that. And so it's really concerning, and I think, one thing is we have to stay the course on groundwater management. I think that's what that makes clear, is this: we have to keep doing a better job of getting our arms around, unsustainable pumping of groundwater, particularly on aqueduct, but around the state. But I think this is an issue that's going to really be more on the mind next year as we kind of dig into it. I will definitely be reading the reports, and that's a potential hearing down the road, probably in 2026.
I'll just add that there is a relatively modest amount of funding in Prop 4 for regional water conveyance repairs, 75 million total. So there's potential for some of that money to go towards this, but I think a key question is what is the state responsibility? You know, should statewide general taxpayers be paying for this project that is a beneficiary is the state water project, at least when we're talking about the California Aqueduct, which has always been a user pays, as Bob mentioned, approach to those facilities, and also the issue of who's causing the damage. So I think there are some policy questions about what the state role for state general fund or bond should be. But there is some money in Prop 4, not specifically for California Aqueduct, but for kind of conveyance repairs, and I could see that being one potential source. But it doesn't come close to addressing the need.
I see Carol's hand.
Thanks. So I'm curious, there's, I get trickles of information coming down from Sacramento about Prop 4, and, I've heard things like, oh, it's being used as a chip between the Assembly and the governor and the Senate. And so I'm curious, are there elements of that $2+ billion that are highly unlikely to get included in this budget? Just kick the can down the road, what those elements might be. Because then hopefully the rest of the stuff that's left might actually get funded. So do you guys have any thoughts or crystal balls on that?
I guess one thing to just note is that there's some stuff that the administration didn't even propose funding now. And a lot of that is because some of these programs are new. It takes time to develop them. The departments aren't ready to go, So some of them, we were never going to appropriate all of the money in year one. We weren't ready to appropriate all the money in year one. So, but I think there are some real questions about how much and which ones. And part of that is also making sure that there's kind of agreement on what that money should go towards. And if there's additional language or anything else that needs to go towards kind of defining how the money should roll out, that should be included as part of the allocation, those kinds of things. And so I don't really have a crystal ball as to like which ones are the ones that are, that there's agreement and which ones aren't. Again, there were some that was done as part of early action. So those ones were ones that they reached agreement on early. I think there's, continuing discussion about the, remainder, but I don't have a crystal ball. But I will just say, like, I think one of the things to kind of keep in mind is just that those are some of the factors that kind of weigh in terms of deciding when to allocate is, how much money is needed in year one? Are they ready to go? Do we need further defining language to kind of specify how it should go out? Those kinds of, and can we get to agreement on what that language or what those sort of parameters should be in the coming month? There is a lot. I mean, I think as Pablo said, I think there are a lot of members and a lot of people who want to see this money go out. I mean, I think there's a lot of interest in that. There's also a lot of things swirling this last month. I mean, there's so much going on. And so I think that's, I think that's one thing that makes it a little bit hard is just there's so much out there that has to land in the next few months or a few weeks. Mm-hmm. So I would think though, my guess is we'll still, there's still a lot of pressure to get this done, but is everything included in there? I don't know. And I wish I had a crystal ball about what would be, but I don't know if anyone else has any thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. Like everything you said, was right. I think, but in my view, Prop 4, that should be the easiest thing to do. I mean, it's just not, and Helen's right. Like if the question really is, I mean, the voters said we negotiated last year, the voters approved it. So this is what we're spending money on. It's not even really a lot of question about what we spend money. The question really is like, how much should we appropriate now? Because are we ready to spend in the next 2 to 3 years? So I think that's not a controversial question. Let's even take a conservative approach and, do 2 billion. I don't know, like, but what you're hearing is right, is what we're hearing. It's like, it's part of this chess game between the Senate, Assembly, and the governor, which I just find really silly to me. even though I work here and I should know better. But I mean, it's like, I think, so let's say I'm optimistic this morning. I'm just feeling I had a good morning so far. So I'm going to say, I think we get this done. This happens all the time. It's like, it's not going to happen. Even last year when the Prop 4 was negotiated, I was involved in that. My boss was very involved in that. A lot of people worked on it, right? But I think, there have been proposals for a climate resilience bond for many years, and it just kept falling flat. And like, we had a leadership transition in both houses in 2023, right? And I remember fall 2023 thinking this is when we should be doing the work, right, on Prop 4. We should be rolling up our sleeves now. We have time. We should be having stakeholder meetings. None of that happened because we were just in this transition phase in the assembly. And finally, it kind of got catalyzed, and it was May 2024 when at least the assembly really started working on it. And we had a working group of legislators and staff. And I guess I just tell this story because a lot of people were asking me, is this even going to happen? Right? Is it going to happen? And I was like, yeah, I think it's going to happen in the end, but it's like, is it how we should have done it? No, right? We should have spent more time in the fall and like been ready to go earlier in the year. But like we got there because it's not like a super controversial issue. It's like it's just sort of how much money we're spending on these different important things. What are your priorities? So I guess I'll take the optimistic view this morning. I only had 1 cup of coffee, so I'm surprised I'm feeling optimistic. I usually need at least 2, but I think they'll get it done. I think it's just there's too much interest amongst the legislators. There's no one against it. So I think we'll get there. But Helen's right. Like the biggest potential pitfall is there's so many big items on the to-do list, and then maybe we run out of time. But I'll choose to be optimistic.
Thanks.
I see Bob's hand.
So I want to follow up with Dave's comment and the linkage with the emphasis on trying to expedite Delta Conveyance project to increase capacity of the state project. At the same time, the aqueduct is reducing capacity. And should there not be a more thorough linkage between the two before cast is stone? Anyway,
yeah, no, it's a valid point. absolutely a valid point. I know that question has been raised in the water right proceeding for the Delta Conveyance project, of like this focus on moving this piece of the system forward when the rest of the system has these growing problems with subsidence. So I don't have an answer. I guess I acknowledge that's a really valid point. And I think we need to connect the dots between the two. Opposition to the project will say, we're overly focused on the conveyance, which is one relatively small piece compared to the rest of the project. The supporters I don't know, I guess I haven't heard a response from them on that, but they're definitely related. And I think the latest cost for the Delta Conveyance is in the $20 billion range or something. And I went on a tour with legislative staff about 2 years ago. I don't know, Rachel, were you on that? Where they showed us where the reservoirs that we're going to use and kind of the construction and the fish screens and all that. And but I remember asking the question, when is this best case scenario? When is this operational? It's like 2042. I'm like, oh my God. But so I think regardless of what you think about Delta Conveyance, and I suspect there's probably more of an opposition in this group, but we're gonna have to do something about the larger aqueduct issues, and it's billions of dollars, and so figuring out how we're going to finance that, because what's the point of building the Delta conveyance if you can't, you've lost capacity, so much capacity in the aqueduct you can't get in Southern California. Like what's the point? And I could see people, there's a valid argument to say maybe we need to shift our focus or shift our resources to address that first. I don't know. So we'll see how it plays out. But
Thank you.
yeah, sorry, I'm giving a wishy-washy answer. But we need to connect. Those dots need to be connected and thought about in a bigger picture. I mean, I think one of the frustrations I heard from the water sector on Prop 4, and I don't think Aqua supported Prop 4, is they felt like they wanted more of a pure water bond, like something like Proposition 1. And they wanted this, like a bigger picture, thinking about what are the highest priorities for water infrastructure. One of the things that kind of got left, I mean, I think there's something like 750 million for flood protection in Proposition 4, but when we were working on Proposition 4, there were also separate flood bond proposals in the multi-billion-dollar range. And so there's some frustration amongst the flood agencies that we really kind of left them at the altar. Like, there's not nearly sufficient funding for flood protection. Kind of the need is just the basic need to maintain what we have is several hundred million a year. And kind of the bigger investment we need is something like 30 billion plus. So, kind of thinking about like, okay, what are all these obligations we have? What are all these needs we have? And this, having a big holistic view of it, and then picking what, so how can we take our bites off of this larger investment need we have in the water sector? I mean, I guess I think there's a fair critique to be had there. Prop 4 helps a little bit, but we're going to have to have a bigger picture about financing and funding all the upgrading infrastructure, maintaining infrastructure.
Well, if it's true, big statement, that the aqueduct is losing capacity and the system is broken. So what is the comprehensive view of making sure that the system is repaired?
Yeah.
Rather than putting so much emphasis on one piece.
I mean, I think ultimately that's going to be something that the agencies that are part of the state water contractor group are going to have to grapple with, if it's their ratepayers who are paying for all of this. They're sensitive to what their rates are too. And so if they have to spend $3 billion to repair the California aqueduct and that's added, those are hard conversations. And again, it raises questions about what's the state's role and what should the state's role be. I just wanted to add on what Pablo said about flood and just highlight that is one in the environmental space. That's one of the most significant areas where the federal pullback is going to be, could be and looks to be pretty significant. I mean, there are other areas like in healthcare where the federal role has been very, very significant, and so that changing role is going to have that's a little bit less true in a lot of kind of our environmental space, but flood is one. Drinking water is another. I would say maybe like zero emission vehicle kind of charging infrastructure is another. Those are three of the most significant areas where we're seeing kind of where there was a very significant federal role that's starting to pull back. And there's even kind of committed Army Corps of Engineer flood project money that looks to be pulled back. So raising a lot of questions about what the state's going to do with those projects and those funding. So just putting an emphasis on the importance of flood, and if there was already an assumption that there wasn't enough funding for the level of protection that we need, that story's getting worse.
Any other questions for our presenters?
We might need to switch back to a more optimistic note. Sorry to
No,
No,
please, yeah,
turn
continue.
pessimistic there. Give Pablo something else to.
I'm with you on that one,
optimistic.
Rachel. I don't have a happy spin on that one. Just don't buy a house in Lathrop, I guess.
Any other final questions? If not, well, thank you all so much for being here. I'll turn it back to Gary.
All right, Meg. Well, thank you everybody for attending. And as we talked about earlier, our next topics, we're going to include the changes in CEQA, as well as cover some of the funding opportunities that have been changed as a result of the new administration. So look forward to seeing you all in the future. And yeah, have a good rest of the day. And anybody who's lucky enough to do some summertime travel, to get that in before school starts. Thank you.